Deloitte Future Talk. Innovation, transformation, leadership, disruption, growth. Let's talk about the future.
So I'm sitting here today at home for the first time for one of these podcasts, together with Eric von Hippel, who is also at home. There's only an ocean between us, and we are discussing today about household innovation, which is actually kind of funny, both sitting at home, learning how to work from home, as nobody is allowed to travel. And so a great time to talk about household innovation. Professor von Hippel, it's a big honor for us that you are willing to talk to us and share some of your insight. Would it be okay for you to introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, of course, and I'm delighted to be here. I have studied innovation for a long time, and I'm at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and the focus of my work is really the newly emerging kind of free and open innovation process as opposed to the standard producers find a need and fill it process.
That's really interesting. I've read you are a seventh generation academic, which is impressive, but is that actually a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's so funny. So my father told me when I graduated from college, he said, "Son, you can do anything you like. You're a free man." And I said, "Fine, I'll become an entrepreneur." And he said, "Son, let me refine that. You are free to do whatever you want as long as you're a professor." So, of course, I went out and started a company. Sons often defy their fathers. But then I saw the wisdom of what he was doing and became a professor after a while.
That's a great story. And so now we are from Germany, as you know, and in Germany, there's always this picture of the inventor being a professor that is sitting at home and yelling, "Eureka," and I found it, and who's inventing a small or a bigger household item. Have you ever invented something, really?
Oh, yes, often. I mean, I started out as an inventor. Even as a high schooler, I was hired by companies as an inventor. So whenever I encounter a local problem, I invent something to solve it. So I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah. And I mean, to our listeners, and we're now already leading into this topic of household innovation, and people may think, well, why is that important? You have found out in a research, if I understand you correctly, that actually if you would add up the R&D budget of corporates as well as now the households, these household innovations would actually make up about half of that R&D budget. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, there are different ways to look at this. And so what we have, I should back up and say that for your listeners who don't know it, everything in the world in management and also government policy has been organized around the ideas that producers are the innovators. And this was really caused by Schumpeter, an economist in the 1930s. And everybody has ignored household sector innovation and not measured it because obviously it doesn't exist because Schumpeter said it didn't. And so now there are 10 nationally representative surveys that show that millions of people, tens of millions, spend tens of billions of dollars annually developing innovation for themselves. And to your point, the ratio of user innovators, household sector innovators, to producers who have hired employees to do this task is over 100 to 1. That is, there are 100 user innovators for every commercial R&D person trying to develop something for a user.
That's really interesting. Do you have an example of a typical household user innovation that wasn't done by a corporate that our listeners would understand maybe?
Well, almost anything functionally new has that history. So mountain bikes, for example, people built bicycles and manufacturers over time manufactured them and they made things like road bikes. But users decided they wanted to go down the hill. They wanted to go down the mountain on a road bike. And of course, the road bike wasn't able to stand for that, so it collapsed. And so they still wanted to go down the hill. So what do you obviously do? You build your own bicycle. And those were the precursors of what we now know today as the mountain bike. It's true of every sport, basically. Windsurfing, kitesurfing, everything. They're all developed by users and not by producers.
That's impressive. And then you wrote in a recently published article on patient innovation, actually, on your observations in a field that people would probably think, well, it's healthcare, it's pharmaceutical. This is not where the end user is the innovator, but actually you found out, or you're pointing at examples where the patient also becomes the innovator, right? Could you elaborate on this a bit?
Sure. I mean, what we have to understand is that patients, when they have a problem or a disease, very often there is not a commercial market that is of interest to producers in solving that problem. So there are, for example, 7,000 or 8,000 rare diseases. None of these really represent a market for a manufacturer. So what happens? You are a patient, or your child is a patient, and you must come up with something on your own. You can't just sit there. Nobody is going to come and help you. So what we see, and for instance, there's a website now collecting these called patient-innovation.com. What we see is that patients solve their own problems. And then eventually, if there is a market, producers come in and start to make something for that patient population as well. Would you like a couple of examples?
Oh, that would be really great, yeah, to understand it.
Okay, so in that article that I sent you, and it's a short article, and your listeners might want to watch it. Or read it. It's free online under a Creative Commons license. So that one focuses on two kinds of innovations. One is services innovation. Now consider, many people have Crohn's disease, and there are, therefore, useful market opportunities for companies to make treatments, to make surgeries, and so on for Crohn's disease. But these things also need to be controlled by diet choices. There is no incentive for producers to explore whether carbohydrates or non-carbohydrate diets help patients in this circumstance, because they're not going to be able to patent a specific kind of bread. So what happens is the patients themselves start to compare their dietary findings and actually run experiments. And you can see that reported on something called chronology.com. Crohn's disease patients around the world share their knowledge and experiences and how treatments have worked. And they do that for themselves, and they can nowadays because of the internet. They do it for themselves because companies don't. They have to do it for themselves.
That's really fascinating. And you just made a point on basically pointing us at tech development, speaking about the internet. When we talk about digitalization, we have this concept of democratization of technology, where we say technology is getting exponentially better. We know these exponential curves. If you flip it around, it's getting cheaper and cheaper. So it's affordable for people to get their hands on future technologies. So what was a big industry robot a few decades ago is now a small household robot, and our kids can work with robots. Our kids can program AI and so on. If we combine now this concept, this basically the household person, the end user is more thinking about what they need than a corporate, and we combine this with the ability of getting their hands around technology, advanced technology. Is there any limit for innovation now in this private sector?
Well, I myself think that innovation is increasingly going to be taken over by users. And let me explain. It used to be thought, or it was the case, to your point that you just made, it was the case that the better equipment and the ability to hire a team was available to producers. Individual users could not do what a large team hired by a producer could do. But now today, what's happened is users not only have easy equipment and design as good as equipment that manufacturers have on their PCs, design software and so on, they also can find each other and share the effort. So what you have, for example, in the case of users designing improvements to diabetes equipment, what you used to have is companies doing this. What you now have is users. Remember, everybody who is a householder is not equally skilled at this. But everybody in a company who goes home at night brings his or her skills with him. The result is the most expert people are available as householders to develop novel equipment. And this has been done now in the case of the artificial pancreas, another example in that article. Patients get together, and quickly what happens is their collective effort is larger than the effort a company can put in. So a company named Medtronic had maybe 5 or so engineers working on what's called the artificial pancreas. A person's wife, a person who was a software engineer, his wife nearly died from not having such a thing. So he started to work on it, and within a few days, 100 people were working on it. 100 top engineers came out of nowhere because they all had this common problem. And they were able to blow the producer 5-unit team into the weeds, as you can imagine. Today, we see this with the COVID virus. People are coming out of nowhere with high skills to develop simple ventilators, whereas producers are, hamstrung by the FDA and other regulations and production and commercial considerations and will we be able to sell these after the COVID epidemic is over, and is it worth the investment? 50,000 users are now working on this kind of problem. It's just amazing, and it happens within days. Sorry, I went on a rant, but to answer your specific question, yes, I think that, in fact, this new form of open distributed innovation based on consumer experts working from home is going to take over most kinds of innovation for consumers.
That's fascinating. Now, if I look now at German-speaking Europe, we have large companies like the auto manufacturers, BMW, Volkswagen, Daimler, and so on. We have companies, Bosch, Siemens, creating refrigerators, other kitchen equipment. We have companies like Nestle doing food and stuff. And all of these companies have huge R&D budgets. Could they learn something by listening to you and becoming better innovators, by better making use of the household innovators, of the personal side of that?
Well, what you'll see, and I try to make all my books and papers free, so I'm not trying to advertise anything here at all. But there is a book called Free Innovation, which you can get on my MIT website, and also I think you can download it from Amazon for free and so on. It talks about the general way that consumer innovation complements producer innovation. So it talks about how producers should go out there, look for user innovations, and then refine them for production. There really is a partnership that's available. What you see is that user hacks work for individual users, but users don't have any real incentive to clean them up in a very sort of mass production way. They also don't necessarily have an incentive to diffuse them widely. So in the case of the mountain bike, for example, the mountain bikers developed all the features of mountain bikes. For instance, when they began jumping, they developed suspensions for mountain bikes. But even those mountain bikers would rather buy the bike from a manufacturer because of economies of scale and get out there and spend their time mountain biking. So what you see is, yes, the users develop these things, they demonstrate their value in use, and manufacturers should stop worrying about unfilled user needs. They should go out there and find prototypes that users have developed and make them better. That's the partnership that, that these companies should have with their consumers.
So in easy words, getting out of the ivory tower of the R&D department and opening up to understanding what the people out there are thinking and doing.
And doing, that's the point. Yes.
Yeah.
What they have now is a marketing research department, and I've noticed with fascination that they'll go out there and discover things that users are doing and then throw that information away and turn it into an unfilled need that the R&D department can then fill. It's crazy, but that's how the system works today.
That's really interesting. Shifting a little bit the topic, Eric, there's a big discussion in Europe right now on digital innovation with regard to the ethics of these digital products and services that are being created. There is lots of companies right now feeling a little bit insecure what they are not legally, but actually ethically allowed to do around digital products? What am I allowed to do with the data of of the people that I have? What kind of services am I allowed to offer? Where am I allowed to use a robot speaking to a consumer as opposed to a human being and all that? Do you think the concept of this free innovation involving households in innovation can actually help to create ethically correct digital products, or is that maybe a threat?
Well, so we have to be concrete to understand that. And so let me explain that, for very good reasons, to go back to the medical example, for very good reasons, medical innovations are monitored in the U.S., for example, by the FDA, and I'm sure you have similar kinds of government organizations, right?
Yeah.
But users, at the same time, are allowed to do whatever they want for themselves, whether the FDA likes it or not. Users are also, in the U.S., because of freedom of speech, allowed to tell each other what they're doing, right? So you get a skilled group of users creating for themselves an artificial pancreas, demonstrating that it helps their health. But now those people are worried because they don't want people without their technical skills reaching in and using this stuff in ignorance. So there is this transition problem where, for instance, there are now hundreds of users of a do-it-yourself artificial pancreas, improving their blood levels. But then they get people coming in saying, I want to help my kid too. I downloaded your design and I set all the parameters to 0 because I didn't understand them. That's a terrible dilemma for these people because what they're trying to do is solve their own problems, which they have every right to do, but they're really not in the business of helping patients who don't have technical understanding. So we have brand new kinds of ethical issues here. How do you, in fact, and people in the DIY medical area are very concerned about it. Yes, we can solve our own problems, but how on earth do we be more careful with people who are not as skilled as we are, and somehow manufacturers have to get in the middle, but we don't know how. So I guess the answer is not exactly about your story about private data and so on. These people have agreed to share their own medical data, but it certainly, as we get this to be mainstream, it certainly is a problem to sort out.
And do we need an instance that would create ethical standards or define ethical standards, or do you believe just the crowd by itself will create the right ethical standards?
Well, the very important thing is that users themselves, because they are users, want to make sure it works, right? They want it to be safe. But, there has to be some... So you don't want to get in the way of these original users creating these innovations. Because when they're creating them for themselves and their children and so on, they're very, very careful. What you want to think about is the larger scale diffusion. Now, I would point out that this is a general issue, that society leaves all sorts of people free to do what they want to do for themselves. For example, I guess you know about all these very dangerous sports, like jumping off a mountain top with a wingsuit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, no government agency comes and says you can't do that, right? You have your personal rights and personal freedoms, and you're taking your personal risks. And that's an example of a consumer-developed sport, which now is very reliable. It's dangerous, but it's reliable. So society in general hasn't figured out, or at least my point would be, don't oppress the originators of this with standards before they can experiment, but do figure out the general diffusion issue and how to get, when other people are involved who are not themselves users or not skilled users, do figure out how to make an ethical process that embraces these user innovations but also makes them generally safe.
Yeah, that's interesting. And
we're not there yet. Yeah, we're not there yet. We have to. This is a brand new system. And we're not there yet with that particular kind of refinement.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And your thoughts are really interesting. And it goes into another question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, in Europe, we have lots of discussions currently whether we are too strictly regulating stuff, whether we are not enough helping young startups to blossom, not enough getting innovation actually on the way. So this big discussion in Germany, in Europe, is, are we in Europe losing the innovation race to the US and to China? What's your view on that, how Europe is doing?
Well, I'm not an expert in specifically how Europe is doing, but I can say that the oppressive quality of regulations has to be addressed in both areas. When we understand that users and consumers are important innovators, then we won't do things like in the US. Are you familiar with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act?
Yes, absolutely.
DMs, yeah. Your readers or your listeners may or may not be, but what it is something that says you will not open up software that has been protected, right? Now, the idea of the government in passing this regulation was we want to prevent piracy of an existing product. But what it did was it prevented users from improving the things that they had purchased. So yes, we have to be aware of, we have to be aware of the oppressive quality of these regulations. We also have to be aware of the fact that existing companies, want them to be in place because they don't want their market threatened. So the companies in the US, many of the medical process companies and product companies, are very slow and comfortable because they go through a giant regulatory hurdle to get something approved, and then they simply don't want anybody else to go through that hurdle. So they sit there comfortably. The wonderful thing about consumer innovation is it's not regulated in the same way. So it threatens these guys' castles, and that's to the good. So yes, I think what you should do is support this kind of consumer innovation, get your regulations off consumer innovation, and then worry about its expansion over time.
I'd like to get to an end with the last question. One of the other topics we're discussing in Europe right now is underinvesting in innovation. And now, obviously, with the Corona crisis and all the companies getting into trouble right now, innovation budgets may be even limited even more underinvesting in innovation. Now, at the same time, you just made some examples on brilliant innovation that is being created as a response to the Corona crisis by private people. So do you think in a few years we may turn back and look at this Corona crisis time as basically a game-changing moment to understand how much power we have in household innovation and how much creative there will be, and it becoming even more important now?
Well, I think this will inevitably happen on the side of the innovation development area for consumers. But again, I think that producers may well have an inbuilt incentive to not do much about it. And I think that governments tend to follow the producer model and not be aware of supporting consumer innovation. So from my perspective, what has to happen is that governments have to be aware of the indirect oppression they are putting on this consumer innovation, and that when that is opened up, they can also add investments into things like maker spaces and so on, that open standards that support this user innovation. And then we'll figure out how to get companies to change. Because again, companies you see it in Germany now. I think you're in Germany, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. You see how the auto companies are just sitting there with their internal combustion engines.
Yeah.
There's going to be hell to pay, but they won't do anything about it until hell has to be paid. So you can't count on them to jump forward. No, maybe small companies and so on, but you can't count on the big companies to do it.
Very interesting. This actually is already the end because we're running a bit out of time. I could have spoken for another hour with you because it's really interesting. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course. You're very welcome. Bye.
Bye.
So, das war's. Vielen Dank, dass ihr wieder dabei wart. Ich hoffe, ihr fandet diese Folge des Deloitte Future Talk genauso spannend wie ich. Wenn euch die Folge gefallen hat, leitet sie doch einfach weiter an eure Freunde oder Geschäftskollegen. Was uns auch ganz wichtig ist, abonniert diesen Podcast, dann verpasst ihr keine Folgen. Das könnt ihr auf iTunes, Spotify, Soundcloud und bei anderen Podcast-Apps machen. Wenn ihr Details dazu sucht, einfach in den Shownotes gucken. Das sind die schriftlichen Informationen, die bei jeder Episode beistehen. Und wenn euch der Podcast gefallen hat, wäre auch klasse, wenn ihr euch eine Minute Zeit nehmt und ihn auf iTunes bewertet. Das persönliche Feedback von euch und auch eure Anregungen sind uns sehr wichtig, denn so wissen wir, wie wir die Podcasts noch besser gestalten können, auf welche Themen wir setzen sollen und so weiter. Einfach auf unsere Website gehen oder auf mein LinkedIn-Profil. Die Details dazu findet ihr ebenfalls in den Shownotes. Da gibt es noch interessante zusätzliche Informationen zu dem heutigen Thema. Ansonsten wünsche ich euch jetzt noch einen schönen Tag, eine erfolgreiche Woche und bis zum nächsten Mal. Ciao.